First of all, thanks for joining us, Colleen. It was quite a surprise for me to read the letter that you wrote in support of Leonard Peltier's clemency. But before we get into that, can you just introduce yourself, who you are, and how you came to be an FBI agent?
Okay, well, I'm a long retired FBI agent now. I retired at the end of 2004. But before that, I served nearly 24 years in the FBI. I, basically tried to join the FBI at the end of law school. I was trying to get into the Foreign Service or the FBI. I was a French major, and in the FBI, they have legal attaché offices in French-speaking countries, namely Paris. So I thought this will work too. It's kind of the similar thing now with the United States having embassies all over, of course military bases as well, but embassies. They have FBI agents in 60-some embassies now. At the time I joined, there was only 13. So anyway, I was at the same time I was doing parallel. I took the test to get into the Foreign Service at State Department, and I took the test, and it's a couple years. It takes you a couple years to get in. And I joined then after I got out of law school. Pretty much we had some odd jobs, but I joined. You know why I joined the FBI, besides the fact of, it kind of fit with my background and everything. But besides that, the reason was justice. So, and I think it's the same thing that people get caught up in a little bit the same as joining the military. You want to be a part of good versus evil. So every little kids, they're teaching this in school. Who is not for justice? So if you have people murdering, that's your prime example, or kidnapping, all these egregious crimes, you would like to serve the public by being a part of that and seeking accountability for crime. It's a very appealing type thing, and we saw this, of course, in old TV shows, even going back to the 50s with Jimmy Stewart playing the FBI agent, and then Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. I mean, they're always as I later found out, the national security state is always working with Hollywood and to produce good TV shows. Actually, when I was a little kid, and this is in the Time magazine, I watched Mission Impossible. So there were good guys doing these Mission Impossibles for noble causes. That was my, Mission Impossible and Man from U.N.C.L.E. So those were the two shows, and it turns out I later kind of became a recruiter for the FBI, and I was on interview boards where we determined if people had high enough interviews, to join the FBI. And lots of people are induced to join the FBI by having watched television shows. I was not the only one. So you have this idea of, working for justice. So when I was in the FBI, though, of course, nothing's perfect, and you start to see little flaws, one thing after another, and especially in systemic policies that, make good people do dumb or bad things. And so after 9/11, especially, when Mueller, the FBI director at the time, was not telling the truth about the fact that it could have been prevented. No one knows for sure, of course, but it at least could have been reduced. And now that's not me saying that. That's actually the 9/11 Commission's conclusion, that if the government, if the FBI had shared information about what they knew at the time, and they knew a lot, they were sending out memos, saying that bin Laden was going to attack. There had been memos earlier in the spring saying that bin Laden and the Chechen terrorists were connected. I mean, on and on. So there was lots of information, and and locally here in Minneapolis, our FBI agents had arrested a terrorist suspect who was learning to fly. So if that had been, the 9/11 Commission actually concluded that if that had been shared, 9/11 could have been prevented. So, of course, Mueller didn't want this to be known afterwards, and so he was saying that there was nothing we could have done to stop this. I even made calls up to his office to say, no, we had a terrorist here. Nobody in the FBI even knew this. I'm not going to go into that because it gets off track. But so you really see how organizationally, groups can really get on the wrong track. And I wrote a memo during the Joint Intelligence Committee that then was leaked to the media and landed me on the cover of Time magazine a couple of times. And then also I was asked to testify to the Senate Judiciary Committee about flaws in the FBI, lack of sharing of information, etc. And then so then I went the next step, and this is another long story. A few months after being on the cover of Time Person of the Year, Mueller was lying again, and he said that he was lying about Iraq. He was, trying to help Bush launch the attack of Iraq based on 9/11. It was not connected at all, but saying, we're fighting terrorism and we have to launch a war on Iraq. So Mueller had told me anytime, when he first talked to me before I testified to the Senate Judiciary Committee, he had said, anytime you spot something like this, Coleen, please call me first. So I wrote him a email, no answer. So 10 days or so pass and no answer from Mueller because he's part of it. And then I actually did give that to the New York Times, and it was a front page on March 7th, I think. One of the very few pieces in corporate media that was against the war in Iraq. To this day, I have had almost nobody tell me I turned out to be right, that the war in Iraq was based on a lie. In the FBI, I was shunned and hated after that, war fever. So then I just tried to make it to retirement. And I had to do, I don't go into it, but I did. I was lucky enough, a lot of people are not. I was lucky enough to make it to be able to get a pension. My pension got reduced because I had to step down from my legal position. I had been the legal counsel in the Minneapolis office for the last 13 years of my career, or actually the 13 before the last year, which I had to step down. And that's my background.
It's quite a storied career. I mean, there's a lot to get in there, and maybe we'll have some time after I get through these questions to talk a little bit more about that, because that was 20 years ago. This is 2022, and that was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine, but
and very few people now even know. I mean, again,
it's not part of the conversation.
No accountability for any of this. There's never been an official. In fact, Bush now, who ordered torture, did everything illegal,
he's been rehabilitated,
lied about everything, and now he's back in power. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and it's interesting too that you also talk about getting retirement. And that's. It gets to the kind of questions that I have, because Jack Ryan, who was a former FBI agent and also somebody who refused to investigate a nonviolent political group, he has been the only FBI agent to come out in support of Leonard Peltier. But Ryan wasn't as close to the Peltier case as you were, being stationed here in Minneapolis in the field office, which historically was the office that led most of the FBI surveillance and investigations on the American Indian movement, since the organization, of course, was founded here and headquartered here in the Twin Cities. So you're the first FBI agent close to the case to advocate for Peltier's freedom. That's quite significant. And you've had a long career in the FBI, and you've seen the agency from the inside. So why now? Why come out in support of Leonard Peltier's clemency now?
Well, Jack Ryan and I have a little bit in common. He was closer to COINTELPRO. His career was during the period when it was at its apex. I actually got exposed to those COINTELPRO files in my second office, because the National Lawyers Guild had won a lawsuit, a FOIA lawsuit, after 7 years. In all of the files on the National Lawyers Guild that the FBI had been spying on, and in each office there were stacks and stacks and stacks of these files that had to be reviewed and redacted, with names redacted. So the poor legal counsel in that office had this big stack, and he asked for help. And I started, looking. This is after I only had like 2 years in the FBI. And I started reading those, I had to. I was going helping them go through it. And you realize that I realized, oh my goodness, did they get carried away? I mean, you read about COINTELPRO, spying on Pete Seeger and Burl Ives. It goes to ridiculous lengths. I then, of course, had the opportunity to talk to agents that were old agents that had worked during that period of time. And a lot of them actually warned you never to do this again. I was warned by one
never
agent.
To do COINTELPRO
Yeah,
again.
he goes, well, you know what happens? He says, things get carried away. This is an agent who actually, he was already retired. He was working in security and someplace, and I was talking to him, and he goes, just a piece of advice, young lady. What we went through during this period, we really went off the thing. Don't ever do that again. And he goes, there will be times. So he was giving me a warning. One of his supervisors had actually been up on charges, and I don't know for what. Maybe something with Fred Hampton or something. I'm not sure what, but it was something like that. So he was close to people later getting into trouble for having followed orders. And at the time, all of the FBI offices were engaged in this, so nobody thought anything of it. Until later on, when things come up and there's an inquiry or something, the church committee, and then you start to worry and say, oh my gosh, we shouldn't have done this. I was warned by retired agents of that, and old agents, and mostly people just laughed about it because at the time, this was easy work. One of the spying operation.
What do you mean easy work?
It was very easy. Okay, in the FBI, you have 300 some different categories of federal crimes. Everything from violent crime, could be violent gangs, fugitive matters, people that have already killed a couple of people. Dangerous work. Anytime you're working violent crime, it's very, very dangerous. Okay, so spying on Pete Seeger, the communists meeting in a house, you drove by and got their license plates. And if you ever go through those files in FOIA, you'll see that this is how it was. It was called post and float. So the agents laughed. This is why they laughed, because if they just posted a surveillance or some other document in the file, then they were fine. They didn't even have to do any, that this was easy work, and it was not dangerous. So it was just kind of driving around, looking at people, following, maybe even following, but and then gathering background. Of course, if you were an undercover or something and actually infiltrated, I suppose it could be a little bit different, but there was maybe some of that. But most of it was, that kind of thing. So most of the agents just laughed about this having gotten carried away, unless they somehow had gotten into trouble. And as the FBI always chooses a certain crime program to be their priority. People know that before 9/11, Ashcroft, the Attorney General Ashcroft, chose violent crime to be his priority. The reason he chose it is because he wanted to reinstate the death penalty. And he put terrorism as the lowest priority. So, people that are kind of conspiracy-minded think that was deliberate. No, he didn't realize that the terrorism would become such a big thing and that he could get death penalties through terrorism prosecutions. So in August, a month before 9/11, he ranked terrorism as the lowest priority of the FBI, and violent crime is the highest priority. So every AG is a political figure, and they do this. And usually the FBI directors obviously follow along. And Washington, D.C. is very politicized that way. So going back to the question of
why now?
Why now? Okay, so a couple of reasons. Someone sent me Ray's letter, which had either leaked out or something, because it was not intended to be made public, is my understanding. And of course, when I read that letter, and he cites the FBI family at least 2 or 3 times in that letter. You know, it brings back the fact that we were all very indoctrinated. You know, even in 1981, January, February of 1981, when I went through FBI training school, there were lectures on that reviewed the FBI's version of the facts.
Of the Peltier case.
Of the Leonard Peltier case. And in gory detail with slides.
So this was a formal curriculum?
Well, you know, the formal curriculum at Quantico is just 3 things. Firearms training, academic, like legal training, and physical fitness. But like in firearms training, so this was actually during firearms training, and I think it came up in others, and you know, maybe some others as well. But in firearms training, like if it was too cold or sleeting or something, we couldn't go outside to practice shooting, they spent hours going through the Leonard Peltier case, more than once. And I said with actually gory slides, because you know it was a very, very sad ambush, and you know there's horrible pictures about the whole thing. So yeah, so that goes all the way back to training school, and then throughout the years, the FBI family. It sounds good, everybody, people make up nice euphemistic terms like a family for something that really is pretty dangerous, which Hannah Arendt, came up with the theory of the banality of evil. How did otherwise good Germans become these monsters? And when you're involved with group loyalty, nothing closer than a family, of course, this is the same thing in police work. So, the blue code of silence. So you get group loyalty. We think of it as a good thing, loyalty to your friends, to your family, but it also can be the thing that blinds people emotionally to being objective and to basically to right and wrong. I mean, it's all throughout history this is the case. And so Hoover, going back to J. Edgar Hoover, which was way before my time, when I was a whistleblower, people sent me Hoover's loyalty poem. Hoover had plastered this, Elliot Hubbard, I think is the author of it, but it's called The Loyalty. It's, the Nazis had this similar thing, and it's about loyalty above everything. Okay, so that poem was on the walls of FBI headquarters during Hoover's terms. And when I spoke out about 9/11, and you're not telling the truth about 9/11, I was sent the poem, the loyalty poem. So, I mean, I'm only touching on the surface of this problem of groupthink, group loyalty, and of course, citing the FBI family is a main way that this is done. It bonds everybody into an us versus them mode of thinking. Like in police, this happens all the time in the police. We're the good guys. We have a noble cause. Maybe we can cut some corners if we can't prove the case. I mean, there are books written about the blue code of silence. And maybe if somebody in our group loses their temper and uses violence, we're all going to keep quiet about it because we're in a quasi-war and we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. Well, this absolutely pervades police work. It pervades military. And so I thought it was, that jumped out at me. That's one of the reasons why I thought. Then the other thing, of course, is just the passage of time. I've been retired now for 18 years. So towards the end of when I was the legal counsel in the 1990s, Leonard Peltier had been in jail for, 30 years or something like that, 25, 30. But now it's nearly 50 years. And because of that, it really is not in sync with any other murder prosecution. Most of, it's an average, convictions now carry an average prison term of about 16 years. And I was well aware of this horrible case of the FBI agent who murdered his informant female informant and drove with her body in his FBI trunk for 2 or 3 days.
That was Putnam.
Yeah, Mark Putnam.
Mark
I was
Putnam.
aware of that case. That was also talked about quite a bit. And he only served 10 years. So you have this contrast. And you know, I thought, well, this is about the time where mercy and the real reasons for having criminal justice. Of course, the reason I joined the FBI, that I learned in law school. 4 reasons. One is accountability, which is kind of a revenge accountability thing. The other one is to prevent recidivism, to create an example so people know, so that there's less other crime. People don't follow that example because there's accountability. And the last one is rehabilitation. And so if there's no danger to the public from recidivists, and certainly when people become, when their health deteriorates and their whatever, it's almost always the case that they are able to pardon. And so when you see this letter and it kind of jumps out to you, well, after nearly 50 years, and there's no mercy and these other, and basically it is just now very vindictive case, which of course was, you know, which began on an emotional level at the time of the murders, but you know, by now it should have faded to the background, and we should be more objective in that.
Mm-hmm. I think
so those are the reasons why now. But basically, because I saw that letter, and and it smacks of. I taught ethics in the FBI, along with legal. Constitutional issues and stuff that affect criminal procedure. But then I kind of, after I became a whistleblower, I got even more into the ethics and spoke at numerous colleges and different groups. And one of the main things I was always saying is, why do good people, you know, FBI is made up of good people, just as Nazi Germany was. Why do good people do the wrong thing? That's the number one thing of ethics. And why do good people that join the police departments, you know, end up...
See, but you're coming at this like from a normative kind of framework of criminal justice. You're not like coming from this from a point of view of like a left or a progressive movement thing. And that's what stuck out to me when I read the letter, at least. And
yeah. And, you know, I'm not coming at it from a change in the facts.
Yeah.
I honestly don't think... I think the facts remain murky. They've changed. The narrative, the prosecutorial theory has changed a little over the years, honestly. And I don't think anyone really knows, unless you were on the scene, that really knows the full thing. So I'm not going to go into the facts. I think they remain the same from day one. But I think what's changed is, you know, is the fact that I've had the horrible thing of seeing this COINTELPRO era repeat. That's another problem here. Since 9/11, this whole thing started to happen again. Things that I knew happened before, and then, you know, with Mueller and then Comey, even torture, for heaven's sakes. Things that you never would have thought possible. Not to mention entrapment, infiltration, all of these things that happened after. And here it is repeating. And there's a reason it's repeating. Because they took off all the church committees' restrictions on the FBI after 9/11. The Attorney General guidelines on the use of informants and infiltrating, all were taken down. Even starting investigations, they were all. So that'll is another thing here, which you see this bad history, you know, repeating.
And we'll get to that, because I have it because this is in the news right now. This idea of a new church committee, but I want to get back to the letter and some of the things you said before. You wrote in your letter to President Biden, quote, "From my earliest training days at the FBI Academy in Quantico, I, like thousands of other FBI agents, was steeped in the FBI's version of the tragedy that took 2 young agents' lives and has imprisoned Leonard Peltier for nearly 5 decades." End quote. You mentioned this before, in this interview, that FBI trainees at Quantico received lectures on the Peltier case, and you kind of have mentioned that this wasn't really a formal part of the training process. But describe what you mean by being steeped in the FBI's version of events on that particular day.
Okay, so I've talked about already on early days during training school. Okay, so that continued. So when I came to the office here in Minneapolis in 1990, already there had been an appeal. There was more than one appeal, but one of the more significant appeals was occurring then. So I read the Eighth Circuit, decisions on this, and it was part of legal training. Okay, so we're supposed to train on First Amendment, Fourth and Fifth and Sixth Amendments primarily, maybe Eighth Amendment too, but those are the main ones for criminal procedure, even including the First Amendment, which is about the infiltration and stuff. And so I had bosses that were always writing op-eds. Not only that, the FBI director, when a call for clemency would occur, the FBI director would oftentimes send out memos, written documents for circulation about the position of the FBI. Okay, again, this is kind of a bonding thing to keep everybody. So when I said steeped, it wasn't just that first presentation. And locally here, yeah, it wasn't the first, whatever. But and locally in Minneapolis, prosecutors would give us presentations of the prosecutorial theory. So yes, we had these for conferences. The retired agents had these types of things. So yes, it was very much a cause. It was a cause, and there are some restrictions. There even were on writing, lobbying. So appointed officials, agency officials are not supposed to, I'm trying to remember what the laws are now, but you're not supposed to be able to use appointed officials for political causes. If you remember, everybody thought it was kind of bad that Bush administration was using those generals to go in front of cameras and talk about Iraq, try to gin up the war in Iraq. So that was all part of it. But agencies are not supposed to spend taxpayers' money on lobbying Congress. There's some fine lines involved in that. But it was allowed to write op-eds. My bosses were allowed to write op-eds. And maybe they had to put a caveat in there. I don't remember that, if they did or not. Or they just said, special agent in charge of the Minneapolis office. And I actually reviewed those op-eds in some cases, and I think in some I even helped draft parts of those, because I was very familiar with the appeals.
You're talking about specifically op-eds kind of urging against any kind of pardon of Peltier.
Absolutely.
So were agents writing op-eds about anything other than that?
Not too much. Occasionally there would be, I was for a period of time the public affairs, I guess you call it. At headquarters they call them public affairs. So like really newsworthy cases, like we had a mass murderer, Andrew Cunanan, who went through and I was the spokesperson for the Minneapolis office on that. So you could be allowed to speak with the press and whatever. I was trying to defend the FBI that he was on the loose for 2 months, and they just knew he was in a red car. So I'd say, well, everybody thinks you can find somebody in a red car somewhere in the United States. So you are allowed. There's some leeway. There's more leeway with fugitives, because that's kind of cut and dry. You're just given the description. That's another thing I've noticed over the years that got relaxed more and more so in the FBI, to the point where the McCabe, the guy who was second in command, got fired by Trump for speaking out on a case. So it got the people in Washington would have a lot more discretion than the people in the field. For people in the field to write op-eds, it was not common. It was not common, but it was, done in the Leonard, to try to argue against clemency for Leonard Peltier. Absolutely.
So it was an exceptional case then.
It was pretty, I would say that was, not done very frequently. Every once in a while there might be a very important thing that they might let you write I remember an issue about digital communications, and our headquarters actually encouraged us to write and talk to the media about it. So there would be some like that. But definitely Leonard Peltier was in those cases, very special times when they allowed. Yep.
So in late 2000, President Clinton was about to leave office. The campaign to get Peltier a presidential pardon appeared very close, and Clinton even suggested that he'd reviewed Peltier's request for a pardon. But on December 15th of 2000, hundreds of FBI agents marched in front of the White House to protest the possibility of Clinton granting Peltier a pardon. Agents carried banners that read, "Never forget," which is kind of ironic that happened just a year before 9/11, because that became the slogan for that. But was this something that was widely talked about in FBI field offices? I mean, you've kind of already answered that question, but can you get more into the attitudes of your superiors at that time, specifically related to this case?
I'm only vaguely familiar with that protest of the White House. It wasn't talked about much in Minneapolis, at least I didn't hear much about it. I'm just vaguely familiar with it. I'm guessing that it might have been mostly organized by Retired Agents Association, and or that it was retired agents who took part in that. And maybe if there was an active duty agent, that they were had to take annual leave for a few hours, because there would be some times when that was the case. Although, even in legal training, we always instructed agents that their personal beliefs would not be a defense if the FBI fired you. So if people had strong beliefs about abortion, or I think even in the case of, I don't know if it was the Jack Ryan case, but there was an FBI agent who had taken his matter all the way to the Supreme Court, claiming that his religious beliefs prohibited him from, investigating or infiltrating or doing something, and lost. And so there's when you sign that dotted line to join the FBI, and then we stress this in legal training, because obviously you didn't want agents to get into trouble, so that if they had a personal belief on something, that was not going to that was not going to matter to the FBI, and they wouldn't be able to even successfully challenge that. People think, oh, I have First Amendment rights. People have reduced First Amendment rights, very reduced, when they're working for the government, and certainly in national security. So again, I don't know for sure on that march, but I think that maybe people did take annual leave, or they looked the other way and let them, participate. Was there what else was part of that question?
Oh, just like what were the attitudes of your superiors at the time?
I don't know of anyone who would have stood up and like a Jack Ryan and said, Leonard Peltier should be free. Mm-hmm. I didn't. When we wrote those op-eds, there was nobody that voiced any dissent against that. No, absolutely not. Not that I know of. Again, it's such a tragic thing, and I said in my letter to Biden that not only were the agents in the wrong place at the wrong time, but Leonard Peltier was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The tensions on the reservation and this environment that had been going on for a long time made things very, very dangerous. And it doesn't take but just a mistaken identity or something like that to trigger it off. And I think even with the facts being very murky, and I don't want to weigh into the facts, I think that definitely was the case. You had a long history, and then you had this buildup, called the Reign of Terror on the reservation, and all it took was a spark. And then you had that shootout, and the agents died, a really bad death. Well, I mean, people aren't going to parse that and be, especially when you're part of, again, go back to the groupthink. When you're part of the group, how many agents are going to parse that out and whatever? They're going to accept the FBI narrative.
And also Joe Stuntz, who was a young man at the time, was also killed during that shootout.
That's right.
He tends to not figure at all in the states or even the FBI's narrative of events, which is also kind of interesting. But I have a kind of a question, because you talk about, or you taught ethics and did legal training in the FBI. And you joined the agency during a time of transformation, as far as I can tell. You know, the dark history of COINTELPRO loomed very large. And officially, the FBI claimed COINTELPRO was discontinued after 1971. So first, describe the COINTELPRO operations. Who did they target, and why did they target those people?
I think this, if you had to go back to the House Un-American Activities Committee, and Hoover himself, who was very paranoid of communism. So when you get this kind of emotional, he had written a whole book about the Red Scare, I think, Hoover himself. He collaborated with the House Un-American Activities Committee, handing over information about people so this goes back to the 50s. Mm-hmm. COINTELPRO as a program gets named later on during the Vietnam War. And I think on top of the fact that you had the Cold War after World War II, and then the HUAC, and the fear of communism, then Vietnam starts. And that just adds to this environment. So people who are dissenting, groups that are dissenting, and of course it's silly things like, starting with like a Pete Seeger singing folk songs, censored on Smother Brothers, for heaven's sakes. I mean, I'm not saying the FBI, but that's part of it. Okay, so then you get into Vietnam, where it's anti-war, so people that were, and there was some quasi-violence taking place with occupying college buildings, but then there's this overreaction and shootings at Kent State and etc. So it's again, it's a period of tension, huge tension. So they become a target. Even feminists became targets. The left as a whole would be said to be aligned with communism. Martin Luther King was the surveillance of him was predicated on some remote connection to somebody that was seen to be a communist or whatever. So it doesn't, and back then you didn't have to have these detailed affidavits under the Fourth Amendment explaining probable cause. Kennedy, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, signs off on a paragraph and just alleging that there's something communist in Martin Luther King. So the civil rights, the trying to think of the other groups involved, student movements, because it's very legitimate if there is even planning of violence and or actual violence. I mean, actual violence, it's very legitimate that's what the old Attorney General guidelines after Church Committee allowed for. That's very fine to start your investigation if a college thing is ransacked or whatever, even really serious physical damage, but certainly, violence to people. Killing somebody. There was different groups during Vietnam, Weathermen, etc., that got carried away. So that's fine, but it wasn't limited. It was then saying, again, this is what's repeated, it gets much more broad. So then you say we can prevent it if we, infiltrate the groups. Then I would say the one extra thing on COINTELPRO is they had the bright idea that they would disrupt. That if they got into the group, they would disrupt and prevent the group. So by joining a group early on, even with no violence at all, they could plant rumors. Okay, the best example is Martin Luther King. Okay, plant rumors about him, threaten to tell his wife, on and on. All of blackmail, essentially blackmail. So you have all of these tactics that go way beyond investigation of a crime in order to disrupt a group. And I think that is exactly what came back after 9/11 with joining even groups where there's no probable cause of violence, and then they, saying they could prevent. And Mueller was a big spokesman. Everybody liked to prevent. After 9/11, you're so terrified that when an FBI director promises they can prevent the next 9/11, you say, fine, do whatever you have to. And that's the mode. You can't prevent. This is like, these science fiction movies, what is it called, The Matrix or whatever? I forget the movie, but saying that you could know what's going to happen, and therefore, it's not possible. It's absolutely not possible. If you get some bit of a notion that some factual, I shouldn't say notion, some factual basis for knowing of a group's intended, which almost would maybe never happen unless somebody comes to you and tells you ahead of time that there's going to be a killing or something like that. But otherwise, you can't go out and round up, right after 9/11, rounded up 1,000 people. And you saw this all repeating from those COINTELPRO period when they actually were doing that. They were infiltrating groups and to disrupt them. And one other part of this is that part of the Attorney General guidelines remedy for this overreaction and COINTELPRO, a main remedy for that was that the FBI could not become the leader of the group. Okay, so if you did have an undercover, okay, this is the fix that came in between 78 and 81 after the Church Committee. Going back to 71, I'm sorry, I'm thinking here. But 71, it's absolutely, completely wrong to say COINTELPRO stopped in 1971. 1971 was the year that a group of anti-war activists broke into an FBI office in Pennsylvania and stole the files. And they didn't even know what COINTELPRO was. No one even knew what COINTELPRO was. And it took somebody later, a year or two later, to figure out, oh my gosh, those files were COINTELPRO files. So they didn't even know what was going on. Frank Church didn't know what was going on. Nobody knew what was going on until it started to break loose in, with the Church Committee hearings, and one of the FBI high-level guys who had been a part of COINTELPRO spoke out, William Sullivan. And that was about 75, 76, okay, that these hearings were taking place. So 71's ridiculous. They didn't even know what was going on. 75, 76, it started to be exposed a little. And but the fixes for those, it takes, all this stuff takes time. Beginning in 78, you had the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which then fixed and said, no, you at least have to have probable cause of a foreign agent. You can't just have Robert Kennedy signing off, he's a communist. You have to have a little bit, you have to have factual justification. So that was one in 78. Then the Attorney General guidelines that restricted FBI's infiltration and supposedly, made it wrong and wrong to disrupt an actual, group, civil rights, any group. Okay, so those came on, I think, 79, 80, 81, maybe. So then training to tell people this is what you have to follow. Just because they get written down and sent out, that doesn't happen. So really, all through the 80s, I think, there was some of it going on. And one big case went on that did become known, which was the CISPES group, which is, I didn't have very much, involvement in that, but I did see communications about where they were infiltrating church groups that were helping some South American countries.
And CISPES is the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a lot of these were nonviolent, church-going people that felt sorry for El Salvador, whatever. So they went too far on it. I remember seeing one where they wanted us to do something, investigate, and we just kind of ignored it in our office. Later, I got a call on this, and then later, an inspector general said, you violated all of the Attorney General guidelines, and there was a big inquiry on the CISPES. And I get a call years later when I'm working in New York saying, your name is on this lead that was sent to your office, and you were supposed to have handled this CISPES lead. And I go, oh gosh, no, I'm in trouble for something I did in CISPES. He goes, and by the way, you did the right thing. You ignored it. There's another thing. You learn later on, when there's an inspector general investigation of the agents that were involved in CISPs, and I had just signed it and not handled it, and the guy who was looking into it said, "Oh, you did the right thing." Amazing, amazing. You never could tell the public this stuff, to be honest. So, anyways, there was that case. But then I think even the Jack Ryan matter is pretty close. I mean, he was told to infiltrate, and he said, "No, I don't want to do that. I can do some other job." And then they fired him just for saying he wouldn't do that. So, yeah, I think things continued. However, we were really pretty restricted. And because you were supposed to have some level of factual justification before you could even open a case. That was for starters. You were not, if you did have an undercover, let's say a violent, something like the Weatherman or something, and you were infiltrating the group, they weren't to become the leaders of the group. Because think about it, the FBI would be leading the terrorist group. I mean, that would make no sense. But before COINTELPRO, they were rising up. Some of these, that's one of the complaints right now with the protest movements, is that the FBI puts in people that take charge and become the leaders.
Like Torrio, the guy for the
I wrote
Proud
an article.
Boys.
I've written an article about it, but that all got erased. All those Attorney General guidelines got erased after 9/11. Little by little, all got erased. But they made sense. And they did, I would say, for the most part, and especially in the 90s when I was giving legal training. So, for instance, one example was the CISPs case was mandated part of legal training. We were supposed to cover that for First Amendment purposes.
Is this public? Because I don't think I've never heard.
If you did a FOIA for legal training or something.
I never heard this before. I never heard anything about the CISPs case becoming like the training for the FBI.
Yeah, it was. We were, after the Inspector General gave a black eye, and there was bad press on it about the FBI had not followed its own Attorney General guidelines, then yes, they tried to, obviously bureaucracies, if they are really under some pressure and whatever, they do try to remedy. And so one of the remedies was to put it into legal training. And I should just say another example of that was after the Oklahoma bombing case, there was a lot of problems with discovery and not having given all of the documentation, because every office had documents on the McVeigh's bombing of Oklahoma City Federal Building. So that summer before 9/11, they kept finding boxes of documents in the Oak bomb case. One of the mandated responses from Louis Freeh at the time was that we had to give legal training on ethics. This is where the ethics training came in, because then they sent it from headquarters, mandated ethics training, based on the fact that the FBI had gotten a black eye during this Oklahoma bombing. It delayed the execution of McVeigh because they had found these additional boxes of things. So that happens. There's knee-jerk type things, but in some ways that might be one of the ways you get a little bit of a remedy to it. So anyways, going back, those restrictions, I know I argued this with a lot of people. Oh no, the FBI's never changed, that's not true, not exactly. Those Attorney General guidelines did have quite a bit of force. And after the Oklahoma bombing, we had high-level people that went to Congress and said, now look, see what you've done. This is why this McVeigh was able to do this, because you restricted us too much. We had a high-level person. And then Freeh went in and said, oh, no, we can live with the Attorney General guidelines. But this went into Congress at the time. So whenever, the thing is, it's not realistic to think you can prevent all acts of violence. You can create cultures and, nonviolent leaders should be doing this. And in fact, they kind of do the opposite, in my opinion. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have so many senseless mass shootings right now, is we don't have good leadership on trying to produce more cultural instilled nonviolence. But the other stuff about saying you can infiltrate and prevent crimes, whatever, that's very limited in what you can do. Even in organized crime, we had undercovers that infiltrated the mob in New York.
Well, like Whitey Bulger.
Well,
Also,
Whitey Bulger was, Whitey Bulger was an example. All those years that we were not supposed to be operating the boss of a group, they were operating the boss of the Boston organized crime family. Can you imagine? Who was a murderer? So for 20 years.
awful guy.
And it wasn't just, afterwards the FBI tried to make it some bad apples. And Connolly, the one main handling agent at the end, he did 7 years in prison. I think he might be dead now. I'm not sure. But he did 7 years, and I think even got some additional time in prison. Like he was the only one. One agent had died. There were 2 or 3 others involved. No, it was a lot more widespread than that. And in fact, my supervisor in New York even got prosecuted for having operated a top echelon. The title for informants, which again, they never made the connection between the restrictions on operating the head, the leader of a group, with organized crime. So you were actually not only praised, but promoted and rewarded for operating the highest level organized criminal. Then it was called top echelon. So if you had an informant who was top echelon, they could be a murderer. Look the other way. This went on for a long time. The Whitey Bulger and the Scarpa case, which was my supervisor got into trouble for, were only 2 that are known, but they were the tip of the iceberg. They were the tip of the iceberg. And so you can see how the spinality of evil, you can see how entire groups, can get off base. And it wasn't just the restriction that all police departments about not having sexual affairs with your informant. Okay, we had an agent who murdered his informant after he got her pregnant. You'd think it would dawn on the people at FBI headquarters that maybe we should prohibit sex affairs between the agent and their informant. You'd think that would be the case, right? No, nothing, no glimmer. And in fact, I knew a number of agents, supervisors having sex affairs. We had 2 supervisors in California having sex affairs with the same Chinese spy, and she stole their documents. And both of them, she stole their documents, their FBI stuff, and they got just a little thing on the wrist, nothing. This was all, of course, we had spies like Robert Hansen, etc. So you see that there's very little incentive for systemic reform unless you have something like a church committee. Even bad examples, sometimes they trigger a little bit of a, not sugarcoating, but what's it called when you make you come up with a remedy that is just kind of, it doesn't serve much of a purpose, like telling us to give legal training about CISBs, which I don't think very many people even did. I mean, things like that. So sometimes it's like that. So anyways, it's very difficult to turn any large group and reform a large group, like especially in national security where secrecy prevails, because the public doesn't even know about it until you have a church committee.
So that gets to my next question then. It's the Republican Freedom Caucus is pushing for what they're calling a new church committee to investigate the surveillance arms of the U.S. federal government, such as the FBI and the CIA. And this is an interesting proposition for a variety of reasons. And it's received a little bipartisan support from Democrats. I think Ilhan Omar came out and supported it.
No, she changed her mind.
No, she changed her mind. Okay, so what was the church committee? I mean, you've talked a little bit about it, and how did the findings of the church committee? Well, you already talked about that, but what do you make of this new push for a new church committee?
Well, again, that did work to some fair. It took a while, but it did work, and it took years and years to finally really be in place. But I was trained on the church committee and on the AG guidelines when I went through in 81. All the offices were kind of, they saw what happened. There were some FBI personnel who were skating on thin ice. Like I said, I even got warned by a retired agent, don't ever do that. My supervisor got into serious trouble. Okay, so when that happened, and then it became public, and serious black eye, took a while, but eventually it put some good restrictions. Knowing this, I've been calling, after 9/11, I've been calling all the time. So as Mike German, a colleague of mine who was an FBI agent, a lawyer as well, joined the ACLU afterwards. And, when we saw that the Attorney General guidelines were just being, burned, essentially, we have been calling for a church committee. When torture, all of these really significant entrapment things in the FBI, all of these very, really terrible things that we were never thought could happen again, we've been calling for a church committee all along. And now that the thing is flipped and it's become a party situation, now you got Republicans calling for it because they were the ones that were the victims. If you're the victim of it, if you're not the victim, if you're the perpetrator, you're not going to call for accountability. Mm-hmm. George Bush is not calling for accountability on ordering torture, or Condi Rice. But when Jane Harman she's a great example. She wanted massive spying on everybody. She was all in favor of the NSA spying. Then she found out she was I don't know if it was inadvertently or what, but she was surveilled and had a tape recording of her that the FBI had, of her trying to rig the AIPAC officials to get off, as long as she could get power in her committee. Okay, so guess what? Why are they spying? As soon as it turns on her, now she's all alarmed. And the Republicans, it turned on them in the last little bit. So now they want a church committee. I say it should be bipartisan, obviously. But the problem is the Democrats in the last few years have been part of this. They've been doing all kinds of planting of misinformation. The Russiagate hoax, that's all planted misinformation. What the FBI directors were doing, I wouldn't say it's even embellishing. I mean, they lied to the FISA court in those affidavits. Really pretty terrible stuff. The Republicans were the victims, so now they're the ones calling for the church committee. And Ilhan Omar, naturally, she heard that there's a church committee. She gives an interview on MSNBC and says, yeah, that would, I think that might be a good idea. And then she was schooled. And now they had a vote. All the Democrats voted against it, including Ilhan Omar, including all of the so-called progressives. So you see the polarization here. Nobody cares about the issue. It goes back to what I'm saying is the problem here is the group loyalty, and that's the problem with the parties. George Washington warned against this. He warned against group loyalty, party loyalty, and that's what you got going on now because people are not caring about the underlying issue, and the underlying issue is that the FBI now absolutely has come full circle. They've repeated COINTELPRO, and it's not going to get better on its own without some accountability. And whether that can be pulled off or not, I'm probably pessimistic it can be right now, just because of the polarized. Washington, D.C. is so polarized. In fact, I was listening on one of the news channels on the way here, and it's unbelievable how polarized all of this is. Nobody is talking as if as an impartial person who cares about the system, improving the system. First Amendment. Everybody from the founding fathers realized if you don't have freedom of association, freedom of press, freedom of speech, that you don't have democracy. And yet the same people that are yelling about bringing democracy to the world are the ones prosecuting a publisher, Assange, in WikiLeaks. I mean, the contradictions are incredible. And why do those contradictions and hypocrisy exist? Because of party and group loyalty. It's loyalty over the substance. And that's exactly what happened in Nazi Germany. It's happened all throughout history. It happens in police work. It's because, and again, this is one of the reasons why in the Leonard Peltier case, it's not, I think Ray, when he wrote this, and he's hearkening to the FBI family, just like a Hoover, just like J. Edgar Hoover, it's to bond us and keep people from thinking and keep people from speaking out, because I think other people would say, 50 years and deteriorating health, and, put it in the context of the history of that tension on Pine Ridge and AIM and all the rest. I think those would prevail, but you got to keep that loyalty as your top thing. And I think that's what, it kind of spurred me to join the call for clemency.
And the FBI surveillance of the American Indian movement was largely ignored during the church hearings and investigations, which, coincidentally took place the same year as the shootout in Oglala on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in June of 1975. And this was at the height of the Reign of Terror, which you mentioned. So given what we know about the hostility towards Peltier and AIM by the FBI in the past, but also today with, Ray's letter, what needs to be done in this particular moment, and what kinds of investigations and inquiries would you like to see?
Probably one of the reasons perhaps why the infiltration and disruption, the COINTELPRO activities directed on American Indian movement, maybe one of the reasons why the church, there might be more than one, but one of the reasons why the church committee ignored that might have been the shootings. So it was such an emotional, hot, politicians, no matter what, don't like to wade into any kind of hot button issue. So that might have been it. They knew the FBI would never, at that point in time, be able to see, again, very emotional at that time. So that might be a reason why it was kind of ignored. I know Frank Church himself was a target of the NSA, so he would have been more motivated for all of this surveillance during Vietnam that went crazy.
It was Project Minaret, right?
Yeah, the NSA had this project called Project Minaret. The FBI had its COINTELPRO, and the CIA had one, I think the name was Chaos, just like in Get Smart. And not very little is known about Minaret and Chaos because they did not have a whistleblower type like William Sullivan. So William Sullivan ended up telling the church committee about some of these workings of COINTELPRO because he was at the table. I think he had Sullivan had a famous quote, something like, well, we all sat around the table coming up with these ideas, one of which was to encourage Martin Luther King to commit suicide letter. We all had these ideas and sat around, and no one said, is it right? Is it wrong? Not a soul. Mm-hmm. A handful of these high-level people. So, but there was nobody who talked about Minaret. And so all to this day, it's still classified. Mm-hmm. Somehow, one little bit leaked out that showed that had 7 of the targets. There were many, many more targeted. And one of them was Senator Frank Church, whether he knew it or not. There was columnists, newspaper columnist, humorist Art Buchwald, Muhammad Ali, of course, which wouldn't be surprising because he was opposed to Vietnam. So he went, not surprising. A couple of editors, mainstream newspaper editors, and another senator. So when you know that these were the, again, if public knows that our national security agencies are actually spying on our own publishers, journalists, government officials, I mean, you can't have it. I mean, we can't. That's the rule of law completely breaking apart. So, I think the church committee was more. They had a lot to look at. That's the other thing. They had a lot, so they probably looked at some of the things that were nearest and dearest to them at the time. And I don't know why they didn't. Those would be my guesses as to why they more or less ignored the AIM. Now, if we were to get a new church committee, and again, this is a topic I have been. Oh, by the way, forgot to mention not just my little nobody, I'm a nobody retired grandma in Minnesota, calling for a church committee. When I had an opportunity to speak or something, I've called for a new church committee for years now. Guess who else has called for a new church committee? Mondale, our very famous Minnesotan Vice President, Walter Mondale, has called, especially after the torture came to light. He said, we need new church committee. And actually, he even got Senator Klobuchar once. I forgot that. He got her one time in a not a conference, but maybe a panel discussion. And he was with her. And you know, he got her to nod her head. Of course, she'll vote against one now because she's part of that Democrat manipulation, whatever. So she don't want no church committee now. But just a few years ago, Walter Mondale was in a public situation with Klobuchar calling for a new church committee. So now, if Walter Mondale was still alive, it'd be interesting if he wouldn't have to recant because this is, again, it goes back to group. Well, there's a lot to investigate. There's been almost zero accountability for where the pendulum after 9/11 because of the so-called war. So every time you have during the Civil War. So during the Civil War, you have sedition laws where Abraham Lincoln is able to go out and round up editors that are against his war. If they speak out in the North, even in the North, he delegated that power to generals. They could imprison editors during the Civil War for dissenting against Abraham Lincoln. So that was, you know, of course we think, oh, that would never happen again, right? Put editors in prison for publishing. Well, it's happened again. But that happened, World War I. That's when Wilson passes the Espionage Act that he wants to be a sedition act. And he is one vote short of getting it to be a sedition. But then after the Espionage Act passed in 1917, they still do it. They still start going after people. They say, well, it's hurting military morale and all this. They put people in jail for handing out Bible verses during World War I. World War II, this is where it all flares up again with the Espionage Act is put into place. And during the Cold War, that's when the HUAC. And then in Vietnam. So we had a lull between, and I think this is another reason why the Attorney General guidelines worked pretty well, is the lull between the end of the Vietnam War and the beginning of the War on Terror. There were some minor things, Grenada and Panama and some other things, but nothing that rose up to be war. And so I was lucky. I look back, lucky to work in the FBI during this period between wars, major wars. And there's not as much pressure for this kind of looking at sedition, they're looking at communism, whatever, than terrorists. Okay, so then when you get to the new war on terror, then the FBI, erases the guidelines, starts joining into, and eventually even comes up with the idea that they can prevent acts of terrorism and whatever. And people accept it because we'd love to believe that, but it's not possible. And now, all kinds of abuses. And so I don't know where they would start, and the Republicans don't have any incentive to do that. They have an incentive maybe to correct how did you manage to put all of this specious Chris Steele dossier into FISA and then afterwards defend it and have people in Congress continue to lie, et cetera. So what about all the planting of misinformation? We did have that one little moment where they were trying to find out who was the source for outing the CIA, Valerie Plame. And it turned out to be, a bunch of them, more than one. A Scooter Libby was one, but all of them. Cheney had told a bunch of them to do it. So there was a teeny little moment of accountability there of looking, you know what? I never have made a list, but the number of times where people in Washington have been told this isn't leaking information, this is planting misinformation. And Cheney started that with Scooter Libby, planting items in the New York Times in order to gin up the war in Iraq. Completely false information. So, I mean, that for starters. I mean, they should, and there's some of them are pretty obvious. The Russiagate, lots and lots, not leaks. These aren't leaks. Leaks connote that it's something true that you're leaking. This isn't leaking. This is planting false information. And now, just the last few days, we know that all of all of our media that ran with leaks that they thought were leaks, that of the manipulation of social media through bots, through Russian bots and this Russian agency or whatever, all false, almost all false. And now the Washington Post said no, that had no impact on the. But we've been terrified. It's used as a propaganda thing. Planting of misinformation is used as a propaganda thing to manipulate the public. And now everybody hates Russia because they're trying to take away our democracy. I mean, and that's the liberal side. It's the Democrat side because they're the ones that were the main pushers of that Russiagate hoax. And again, some of this may come out, maybe. The censorship of Twitter, part and parcel of all this too, and some of that's come out because of Musk saying open up the floodgates and getting good investigative reporters. It's going to take a combination of real leadership and some corporate. Some of the media has to see the light at this point, and they have to say, we can't be. We're supposed to be challenging power. We're not supposed to be having our secret government source whisper in our ear, and then we go out and write up or transcribe
verbatim,
nearly verbatim sometimes, and then it runs rampant throughout all the media. What's that doing to our country? Mm-hmm. Hopefully, there's somebody with a bigger in these media organizations that has a bigger view of things and realizes that no. This might be a 1976 moment. This might be wishful thinking because of just how far we've come on this. I'm very pessimistic that in this current environment because it works so well to manipulate public opinion. Noam Chomsky wrote a book on this, and manufacturing consent works really well. You press people's buttons, emotional vulnerabilities, fear, hate, greed, false pride, and blind loyalty. Well, politicians are very adept at doing that. And the last two, people don't think of the false pride and the blind loyalty as being so manipulative. Frankly, they're as manipulative as fear is. Because when you're told that your group, this is a social psychology experiment, the Zimbardo experiment, when you're told your group is superior and you're the bosses, you are capable of really doing some bad things. They had to stop these Zimbardo experiments in classrooms amongst classmates because people were turning so bad so quickly just by being told that they were superior. And of course, that's what American exceptionalism is. It's what, religions are based on. It's why you had the Crusades and, these things that were, because you thought your religious group was superior, your ethnic group. If you're told that you're superior, we're really Aryan supremacy, Israel, the chosen nation. So when you're told these things, it works. And so I don't know if we can ever cure that. I don't know what the answer is, but the answer would be really, really stressing that this is so counterproductive. That manipulating public opinion, manufacturing consent is really, might take a while to show how bad the end result is. But it's always going to boomerang back on you by doing these wrongful things. All of ethics, all religions have things like karma, or in a Christian religion, reap what you sow. We all had this notion that violating, murdering main ethics rules, principles, would eventually come back to haunt you. And I think we're at a moment where people haven't quite understood that, especially in the United States. But I think that's the fix here. That's the root cause fix for people as a culture to get more of this old-timey training, reap what you sow, karma, what goes around comes around. I mean, all these, you never hear this anymore.
Yeah.
I wrote...
Well, combine that with a low media and information literacy, it's a recipe for, it's a recipe for increased violence.
Yes.
And
very difficult to make people understand. I've written articles about the boomerang of violence wrongful violence that we do all over the world, and how that is boomerang back into the senseless mass shootings and other suicide and homicide. It's not just homicide, it's suicide too. Suicide's off the chart. And so this is boomeranging back, and it's because we have culturally embraced this kind of violence, but only on others. But we don't understand that it's come back now to take, to overwhelm ourselves. And it's very hard. One thing is, the shooters, a high proportion of shooters are former military because they've been desensitized. Police were given all this military equipment and basically told, you're in a war. You're in a war on terrorism. So it's you wonder why when you posit an ends justify the means, like a noble cause. I was in discussions with professors, law professors, arguing that torture is ethical because it saves lives by finding the ticking time bomb.
that was the guy. What was his name again? That was here at Augsburg, or not Augsburg, St.
Thomas?
St. Thomas.
Yeah. Well, they had their theory, John Yoo and Delahunty, their theory was imperial presidency, and writing about Abraham. You wrote a whole books about that war presidents are the only presidents that matter. He's very pro-war on all levels, and the fact is, and the title was called Imperial Presidency. That was the title of the discussion. And so they think, I think it's Article 2 in the Constitution, empowers a president to declare martial law. And, of course, that's what Abraham Lincoln did. So if you use that as the model, he goes, Abraham Lincoln did this. So if you want to, we revere Abraham Lincoln. So that was the model for George Bush to order torture, to massive surveillance, all of the terrible abuses that have followed 9/11. It's the model. And so that type of thing, and then ends justify the means. So you sell it by saying your noble goal, okay, the newest one is bringing democracy to the world. Who isn't for that? Everybody's for bringing democracy. We're all for it. Democracy at home. So we're all for having, that's used both ways. In any event, but then you say, well, how do you get that? Well, Samantha Power says you have to bomb those countries to bring them democracy. So did George Bush. You have to bomb them and take over their governments, and then you can bring democracy. And of course, anybody who's studied history and whatever says, no, rule of law, you can't just put up a puppet government and think you're going to get rule of law.
Well, that's how they introduced democracy to indigenous people.
Yeah.
And it's also just worth pointing out that John Yoo cited the Modoc War as a legal precedent to create a state of exception, because he was saying that during the Modoc War, the Modoc people who resisted the United States government in California were stateless enemy combatants. So therefore, they didn't have any rights, and this is what the justification was for. Yeah. So like historically, there's that boomerang too. This doesn't appear out of nowhere. This is somebody like you, a very smart, intelligent person. Like these aren't idiots.
No.
And they're citing legal precedent based on the history of this country.
Well, they're very adept at twisting, and this is wordsmithing, as Noam Chomsky said. If you're very good at picking words, you can basically fool a lot of people, because everybody's, like I said, everybody's for democracy. Everybody's for human rights. Human rights has been used as a pretext. And, going back to the lawyer's role in this, lawyers, everybody's appalled at how bad the lawyers. I mean, we got a federal judge now that signed off on the torture memos, Bybee. So everybody's appalled at how the lawyers and in the ABA, in the Psychology Association, all went along with this. But I was asked 4 times to give commencement speeches at law schools, and this was when I was on the Time person.
Yeah,
so
Time.
Okay, celebrity. So I got asked.
Just for everyone's information, you're the first Time Person of the Year that I've ever interviewed, and you're the first FBI agent that I've ever interviewed.
Oh boy!
So.
Yeah, and
that I know of, at least.
Yeah, it's gonna be a long time before you can find a second one, I think. But because again, I was just lucky to make it to retirement.
Yeah.
Really lucky, and I was kind of forced to retire. Otherwise, they would have gone after me. I was told that, so I knew I had to retire as soon as I turned 50. So the title of my commencement speeches at these 4 schools was pedophagy. It's a long, I never heard this term before. It's an arcane term, but it means basically shyster. So lawyers can, they're in it to make money too. And they see what side the wind is blowing. And there's all kinds of little games. We know about tax loopholes. I mean, different branches of lawyering have a lot of shyster parts in them. Even divorce attorneys, every part of the law, there's a temptation to fudge things or to use it for your own advantage. Okay, so my title was "Don't Be a Pedophager," and I got the quote that I learned about pedophagy from a book written during the Vietnam War. The CIA agent who opposed the buildup of troops. He opposed the line. I should say he opposed the line that was taking place right before the Tet Offensive. Westmoreland, who was the main general in charge, was lying to the press that the U.S. had killed so many of the enemy. He was saying they had killed 500,000. Killed 500,000 or something like this. I forget the huge number. And he was lying about the relative strengths. And so the CIA guy, lowly guy, said he had already done the study internally. Not true at all. It was half of what Westmoreland was lying about. So there's a whole book written called The War of Numbers. And when we started the War on Terror, I read that old book, The War on Numbers. And when you get to the end of it, now it's known. Now it's known Westmoreland was lying. 60 Minutes had a whole expose where they tarnished Westmoreland, or a little bit at least, about this. And it's known, and the agent says, or the CIA guy who fought him, lost his job, and he died an early death as a result too. He says, everybody, it was just like, it was pedophagy, and he lists a whole bunch of things. He goes, it was just like somebody had put something in the water. And so when you get it so widespread, and again, this is the banality of evil, when it's so widespread that you can't even tell because it's in the water, and everybody's a part and parcel. He opposed the line about the Vietnam War, and he got one other low-ranking colonel or somebody. There were a couple of them. We shouldn't be lying about this, to gen up more war, whatever. And and then he's got this little sum up of how this happened, and I'll send it to you if I can find it. But this is my commencement speech to law schools, because the law schools all churn out people that become John Yoo. He's hardly alone, and we see this over and over again with Office of Legal Counsel memos legalizing what previously was completely illegal. And martial law is if you actually declare martial law, that's saying no more rule of law. We get to do what we want. We can do anything we want. No, martial law. And that during time of war, that's the only time a president can declare martial law. And so you get the pressure for them to do this. And after the War on Terror, that's what happened. Actually, John Yoo's memos written the first month or two after 9/11 approach very nearly approach martial law. He's basically saying no more freedom of press. He's basically saying that in these memos. You know, he doesn't outright say it maybe, but very close. And they're very good. They're wordsmithing, and, you know, they're educated. And then, of course, who am I, when you're watching television, who is a normal person to question any of this? You know, you can have your, I don't think that sounds right. You know, people might do that a little bit. Even in the FBI, I used to, you know, talk about, well, a lot of us, when things would happen, whether we get an order or something, you know, there'd be some mumbling and grumbling, but internally, you know, I don't know, that doesn't sound good. I got caught up in things that, you know, actually a couple things that were investigated afterwards because they were wrong. Luckily, like the CISPs one, I was told I did the right thing by not doing anything on it. Another time in New York City, we had murders of police officers on our task force that happened, and the agents went out to Italian social clubs and went way across the line, definitely did some damage, and even went, you know, illegally, some a little bit, I don't know if it was terrible violence, but, you know, roughing up type things, because this is the New York way. And I went home. That night, they were all going out. It was all being whispered about. I just decided to go home. I was the only one who went home. So people, you know, and people would like, oh, I don't know if we should do that. But, you know, this is how the Germans, you know, you're getting the orders coming down, and you're in this big group, and very few people are going to be Jack Ryan. You know, it's Endor, the FBI laboratory whistleblower, Frederick Whitehurst, only forensic lab in the country that was not accredited. And why was the FBI lab resisting the testing and the validations to become accredited, scientifically accredited, for years? Why were they resisting? Because we were told the FBI lab is superior. It's the top lab in the country. Why would we stoop so low as a state forensic lab and have to get accredited? Because we're the FBI. So this kind of pride and group loyalty is just a very pernicious thing. And eventually, when they did get accreditation, they found out a lot of problems, a lot of mistakes unearthed. Probably the lab now is doing so much better than it ever could have done without accreditation. But they resisted it at the time, and they made the whistleblower, Frederick Whitehurst, have a nervous breakdown and fired him. And it was just like Jack Ryan, fired him. Luckily, he sued, and because the whistleblower regulations had not been not only adhered to, they hadn't even been codified by the FBI. The FBI didn't even put them into the Code of Regulations. So even though it was law, they had just completely ignored. And so Frederick Whitehurst, the lab, he won the lawsuit and did get some recompense from the FBI. But yeah, not after years and years. And all he was calling for
was just accreditation.
Yeah. You know, calling for
standards.
I called for stopping sexual affairs with informants, totally ignored. So, you know, the resistance of these big, powerful Washington, D.C., networked, you know, it requires something like a church committee, and it requires somebody like a Frank Church to realize that this isn't isolated on others. It can boomerang back on us. And, you know, and that's really hard for people when they're part of the perpetrators of something. It's very hard for them to understand that crossing these long-standing ethical principles, you know, the 10 Commandments, do not murder, things like that this will eventually come back to bite us. It's very hard when you're in the group. You think, oh, well, we can do it to others, but it will never come back to bite me. I don't know how we can get that across. I mean, it's very difficult because I've tried, like I said, writing things, and it's very difficult.